We are so excited to have you on with us today because today is the big day here in Dallas. Of course, it's the big anniversary, and there's a lot of mixed feelings about remembering this day here. It's tough for a lot of people that remember it, and for those of us who weren't around during that time, there's a sort of fascination with it. But your film goes in a totally different direction than I thought it would, because we've seen quite a bit on JFK, of course, but this is a totally new perspective, and where it goes, I don't think people see it coming. Is that kind of the feedback you've been getting?
Yes, and that's particularly gratifying, but that was my intent. I mean, for me personally, I heard the news of the assassination when I was a patrol boy. I was in sixth grade in Marblehead, Massachusetts, standing next to the policeman controlling the traffic lights. And we both heard the news on his police radio at the same time. And so it left an indelible mark for me, but it wasn't something that I focused on particularly. In the 1970s, I came to Dallas for the first time by Greyhound bus and was visiting a professor that I ended up coming to Dallas to study with. And I got off downtown. I just, clearly I wanted to see the assassination site, but it was very desolate in the 1970s. I mean, things were kind of boarded up, the window, then the fifth floor, the window where Oswald had his perch was boarded up. It was haunting. And going forward from there, it wasn't a place I went back to very much. And the museum started. I was very aware of the films that were being made for the museum, and I went to see the museum. But about 10 years ago, I got a commission from the International Center of Photography in New York to do two pieces that have become integral to this new movie. One was a piece that I did on Marianne Moorman, and the other was a sound installation related to songs that were written to memorialize Kennedy. And this was done in New York, but it was also an installation at the Dallas Museum of Art in their C3 theater. And as time went on, as we moved toward the 60th anniversary, I wanted to look more deeply at the legacy of Kennedy and from the points of view of people who are not usually considered.
Yeah, and it's quite an interesting question to pose. What would have happened, had he not been assassinated, had he gone on and done all the great things that many people expected. But where it goes now is showing the harsh realities of what we often see downtown, and it is sad, and it's going to be hard for some people to watch, but it's something that kind of needs to be seen, though, right? Because these are people that you interviewed in there that we don't often really get to see or take the time to see, really.
Well, it was particularly striking. My wife and I live downtown Dallas, and so it's exciting to see how downtown Dallas is transforming. However, I go for walks daily, and on weekends I walk around downtown, and I was particularly struck by the number of homeless people who were in close proximity to the assassination site. So I started talking to homeless people. I started talking to, as there are lots of people from foreign countries, from Europe, from South America, from China, and elsewhere, who come to Dallas to see the assassination site and go through the museum. And on one occasion, I was, I started talking to one homeless person. I talked to the first one, and he's in the film. I asked him about, what did Kennedy mean to him? And he was like, well, Kennedy would have helped the homeless, which surprised me that he said that. And then I asked him why, and he said, because he's a good guy. And he didn't put it in the past tense. And that stayed with me. He didn't go into a lot of detail. And then some weeks later, I was talking to someone else, and he was much more vocal. And he was about what Kennedy meant to him. And he heard the news when he was in an orphanage as a little boy. And as a homeless person on the streets of Dallas, for him, Kennedy represented a promise that was unfulfilled. He focused on Kennedy's pledge to eradicate poverty. And he made the comment to me it's in the film, in a very impassioned, Kennedy would have, said, do something for the little guy, help him out, give him a break. And that really made me see an aspect of the Kennedy legacy that hadn't really been explored. And then I started doing research into what speeches were made about homelessness in the early 1960s, and particularly in Texas. And I couldn't find really much about use of the word homelessness. It was conversations about poverty, because after Kennedy was assassinated, of course, his brother Bobby took up the torch, but then it was, Lyndon Johnson launched the war on poverty. But we look at the world today, and homelessness is out of control. And I found it particularly interesting to focus on homelessness as it relates specifically to Dallas. I had done a work, and I was the founding director of a museum that I conceived called the Museum of Street Culture, and did this work between roughly 2012 and 2018. And I was working with the First Presbyterian Church of Dallas and the Stewpot. And that's when I met the other people that are in this movie. And the film shows their lives, snapshots of their lives over a period of 3 years, the ups and downs, the reality. And I was particularly struck by this one individual who broke down in tears when I was filming him, talking about the predators on the homeless and the scourge of K2, which was at that time really devastating the homeless population. And despite everything he was saying, it was interesting to me that he used this image of that for him being homeless was like playing Russian roulette, that he didn't know when the bullet would come for him. But yet, given all of that, he was a hopeful person. And he himself was talking about how he wanted to not only help himself, but to help others. So in the end, I think the film is a hopeful message that individuals and others, you see people providing services, that there's that relief bus that parks itself within blocks of the Kennedy assassination site, and that tries to provide services to homeless people.
And I think that's a beautiful thing for people to see. And the feedback that you've been getting so far, is that the message that people have been getting? Because I think it's a possibility people may take away something different depending on, what their life experience is.
I've been particularly gratified. The reviews have been great, and people have really responded well to this. And it's not a conventional documentary, and I didn't intend it to be such. I didn't want it to be authoritarian. I wanted it to be a kind of, the abiding image, I guess, would be like the snapshot that Marianne Moorman made with her Polaroid camera of the first bullet striking Kennedy's head, to the snapshots which are expressed in songs that were written soon after the assassination in just about every musical genre, from country and western to blues to gospel to American Norteño music to even calypso. And those songs I put throughout the movie. They had been in part the substance of my sound installation, but in this film, they're punctuation points, they're commas, they're ellipses that lead you back to the importance of memory as it's expressed through music. and to create this kind of composite view of how is public memory shaped. For me, the film is about the tension between art and ideas. I wanted it to be informative in areas that people were not that familiar with, but I also want people to feel something, to come into deeper contact with their own feelings and how they feel about others.
Yes, and they certainly will, and that's beautiful. You know, with your wide body of work, you've done a lot of really interesting and touching and very thoughtful things. And so I'm curious to know for the people that are, will see this or maybe have seen your other work or read your other work and think, okay, this is the kind of career I want to have, the kind of life I want to have to, highlight these certain things. What kind of advice would you give them?
Well, I have had a free-form career. I mean, I was on a path to become a university professor, and I came to Dallas in 1980 to finish a doctorate. I had been teaching at an art college in Ohio and had this opportunity to come to Dallas, and the professor that I was working with was able to help me pay in-state fees. And it was the Arts and Humanities program at the University of Texas at Dallas. And he encouraged me, I had a master's degree, but he encouraged me to get a PhD to level the playing field. And during the time I was a graduate student, my first film and book were published and released in 1981. I came to Dallas in 1980. My professor, who was a mentor of mine, sadly got brain cancer. He died. I didn't get my degree until 84. And I wasn't really planning on staying in Dallas. But after getting my degree, I got a commission from the Dallas Museum of Art to do 3 short films, an anthology cassette, and a small book called Living Texas Blues, which was shown to show the parallel development of regional style of blues music to the regionalist painters known as the Dallas Nine, who gained national prominence in the 1930s. And after finishing that, I started the organization Documentary Arts, which I have been the director of now for nearly 40 years. I've only ever been a contract employee like everyone else that works for Documentary Arts. And we have a low overhead. It's very project driven. And in 1988, I met my wife and raised my family in Dallas. And so that's how I stayed in Dallas. To answer your question, and I've given talks about this before, I was invited back to where I got my undergraduate degree at Ohio State to talk to graduate students. And the subject that I wanted to talk about was, how do you make a living doing what you really want to do? And for me, it's always been about following the passion for the work that I want to undertake. I've always had a mission. I have a deep belief that the world can be better than what it is, and that we can all contribute to that. So that's part of the spirit of everything that I make. And the organization Documentary Arts that I started has the mission to broaden public knowledge and appreciation of the arts of different cultures and all media. I grew up in the inner city of Boston. I grew up in a mixed world. Fortunately, I had parents who were socially progressive, and that helped me to really want to experience the other in addition to people who were like me. So I really think that it's hard to do, but it's possible if it's the commitment that one has to undertake to make that happen. Now, years later, with Documentary Arts, we do offer internships. We've established 2 fellowships at the International Center of Photography in New York, because it's difficult to find your way through this. I had mentors. I'm a collaborator. And that's another big part of it, is finding people you can collaborate with who can help advance the mission that you believe in.
Absolutely. Well, you'll be familiar most likely with my co-host Drew Pearson, one of our great Dallas Cowboys, and caught the Hail Mary, went in the Hall of Fame a couple of years ago, and we're super proud of him. So we love to ask people their Hail Mary moment, which is that moment in your life and career. We just had to go for it, and it worked out for you. What do you suppose that was for you?
Well, I think I've had more than one. I think I've been fortunate and blessed to be able to, be faced with difficult situations and finding my way through them. For me, I think my biggest commitment was my first book in film. And it was when I started my first published book when I was 21. I really didn't know much about book writing. My father had aspired to be a writer. His career was interrupted by World War II. He was a nurturer for me in many ways throughout his life, lived vicariously through what I did. And I did a college paper about, I was taking a folklore course, and I had to do a fieldwork project, and I wandered off campus. This was in Columbus, Ohio, and I saw a tattoo shop. I had never seen a tattoo shop, and there was as I stepped up to it, there was an electric eye flashing on and off, and inside was this man hunched over in a wheelchair. And I went back the next day. My parents had given me a 35 millimeter camera for my 21st birthday, and I started snapping pictures, and he shouted at me to get away from his shop. And finally I came back, and he invited me in and said that I, was rude for not asking permission to make his picture. And I realized he was right, and I apologized, which was one of the first great lessons of my life in terms of being a photographer, in terms of understanding the nature of the interaction that one has. But he was someone who had been a circus and carnival freak and had found this, life, and was a tattoo artist. He had been a sword swallower in the circus. And I wrote a college paper about him. The college paper became a journal article. And then I wanted to do this book. And I was by then in graduate school in Austin, wanted to do this book. And I came back to where my parents were living, and I told my father that I wanted to leave graduate school to write a book about this man. And he said, well, I'm going to go meet him, not with you. And so he went down to this, and my father was probably the last person on earth who would ever want to get a tattoo. And he came back home and he said, yeah, you ought to do this book. And I started work on that. And it was in the 1970s, and it was a time when there was beginnings of a lot of ADA type legislation. And this was someone, who was severely disabled. I mean, he could barely open his hands. He was in a wheelchair. He had a hunchback. He had been denied an education because he was too grotesque to go to school. And it was the opposite of the Elephant Man story. He made a good living in his profession. He played to people's fears, and he gave me his life story. And in the middle of that, I wanted to make my first film and got my first grant from the National Endowment for the Arts to do it. But the obstacles I faced were great. The book was rejected 18 times before it was published. By then, I was teaching part-time at an art college in Ohio. They agreed to be the fiscal agent for my grant, so long as they never received the credit in the final film. There was obstacle after obstacle. And then there was a blow up with my first film crew. I continued to make the movie. The movie premiered in New York. I had the good fortune of Vincent Canby reviewing it, who was the A-list reviewer for the New York Times at that particular time. And the film showed as part of, it was got this amazing paragraph. The following spring, it showed as part of the new director's series at MoMA and started to show internationally. So the Hail Mary pass for me, I guess, was a long one. It spanned most of my 20s, but I just stuck with it. and because I believed in that story. And so the obstacles I faced and the disappointments and anguish I experienced, it was a long past that went over several years.
Yeah, and often it is, but that's a long time for a ball to be in the air.
Well, that catch of Drew Pearson's is, I remember that catch. I was watching it on television.
Yeah, he's amazing. Well, part of that, and we talked about this on the show, is that success mindset, or maybe it's a stubbornness that you have to keep going even when things are tough. So, and often these projects, books and documentaries, they take years out of your life. And so is there something that you keep in mind that kind of keeps you on the right path and keeps you going even when things are tough?
Well, that's why I work in a lot of different forms. And I learned through those 8 years, from, thinking I could write a book to it finally coming to fruition and making that first half-hour movie. I mean, after all that, that first book was just published in its 40th anniversary edition, Stony Knows How. And my film that I made then is still in active distribution 40 years later. So what I learned in that process was you need to do something else while you're waiting around to see whether or not people are going to like what you're doing. And so I, started writing other books. I started writing poetry when I was 18. So for me, I go between creative activities. So I'm always creatively active in that sense. And that's what keeps me going. The joy is in the making. And I think that if you want to pursue a career that is, in some sense, unconventional, then you have to truly enjoy what it is you're doing. You have to believe in yourself if you ever hope for others to believe in you. And it might not happen right away. So for me, it's balancing, and I like working in different media. At core, I see myself as an artist, and I just see the world from a lot of different vantage points. I just finished a big project in Dallas. I don't know if you're aware of it, but it's on Deep Ellum, and it's 5 exhibitions that I organized. The first that between September and the last just opened at the African American Museum just a few weeks ago in November. But it was work that I did when I was in Dallas. While I was, struggling to get a PhD, I started getting interested in that music. I started writing about Texas blues because no one had really published books on Texas blues. And so it's always one thing that leads to another for me.
Well, yeah, I was curious about now. I can't wait to see what you're working on next, but it sounds like you probably got a few things going on, right?
Well, yeah, you ought to check this out. I mean, I would think your listeners would be interested in these exhibitions because it looks at Deep Ellum from 5 different vantage points. And there's the new Deep Ellum Community Center, for which I did a permanent exhibition and a temporary exhibition. And then I did a public art installation under the I-345 overpass. It's called Invisible Deep Ellum. And it's about the Black businesses in Dallas that were bulldozed away when they built Central Expressway. And there are 2 exhibitions at the African American Museum. One is called Seeing a World Blind Lemon Never Saw, which are landscape photographs that I did in East Texas. And a second exhibition called Central Track Crossroads of Deep Ellum. And in conjunction with this, there are 2 new books of mine, one on Deep Ellum, one on Blind Lemon. The Deep Ellum book was co-authored with Jay Brakefield. The Blind Lemon book co-authored with Kip Lornell. So I'm still very much involved in working in Dallas. Dallas is my primary residence. I also work a lot in New York City.
Oh, that's great. Well, before we let you go, JFK, of course, has a lasting impression, and just so many people, especially on this day, remember him so fondly. And is there something that what is it about the man himself that made you want to do this? Because he was a special person that we're lucky to have on this earth when we did.
Well, I was particularly struck when I started in earnest wanting to pull this together into a movie and going to the assassination site and talking to people. And there's so many people from around the world that come. And I was particularly struck by an African-American man who, has one of these informal tours. We've all seen them around the site. And he was talking about the meaning of JFK in his life, that for his grandfather, it was the first time he had voted in a national election in his life. And the lasting resonance for Kennedy's legacy for me is the message of hope. And we are so much in need of that in today's world. And so I wanted to make a film that looked at complicated relationships that are not usually considered, but at the same time, I wanted to create a film that showed that on a very basic human level, that legacy is still possible.
Beautifully said. Well, we really, really appreciate your time and I appreciate you making this film. I can't wait to tell everybody to check it out, and hope to have you on again soon. Hope you heal up well, and we're going to keep following what you do and tell everybody to check it out.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. The film is distributed by First Run Features, and you can find out more information. It's going to be streaming not so long from now, and I very much appreciate your time, and I'm glad to connect with you and Drew Pearson, who I've always admired.
Oh, that's wonderful. I'll pass your best wishes on to him, and hopefully we can have you on with him soon.
Okay, great. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.